Welcome to the program this afternoon. I appreciate your presence and your joining us. My name is John Ketzenberger, and I'm Director of Government Relations for the Nature Conservancy in Indiana. The Nature Conservancy is pleased to host this afternoon's event, Innovating and Growing Climate Solutions in Indiana. At the Nature Conservancy, we believe farmers are among our greatest conservation allies, and by working together, we can develop science-based common sense solutions to the climate challenge. Over the next 90 minutes, we hope to have a thoughtful and robust discussion about the many ways Indiana's farmers can be part of the climate solution and how Congress can support these efforts. We're pleased to be joined today by Indiana Senators Mike Braun and Todd Young, as well as Representative Trey Hollingsworth from the state's 9th District. All of them recently introduced legislation that seeks to help Indiana's farmers adapt to or mitigate the effects of a changing climate. And we look forward to discussing these policies in greater detail in just a moment. Later on, we'll be joined by 3 leaders of Indiana's agriculture sector, including Bob White, who is Director of the National Government Relations for the Farm Bureau in Indiana, Jordan Sager, who is Deputy Director of the Indiana State Department of Agriculture, and Dr. Jeff Dukes, who's Director of Purdue Climate Change Research Center. Bob, Jordan, and Jeff will then lead a discussion around what Indiana's farmers are already doing to advance climate solutions, opportunities on the horizon, as well as the barriers that need to be overcome. If you'd like to participate in the conversation on social media, please join us in using the hashtag ClimateIN, or you can also tag the Nature Conservancy in Indiana on all platforms at nature_Indiana. So up first, please join me in welcoming Senator Mike Braun, Senator Todd Young, and Representative Trey Hollingsworth. Senator Braun serves on the Agriculture Committee, Budget Committee, the Appropriations Committee, the Aging Committee, and the Health Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee. In 2019, along with Delaware Senator Chris Coons, he established the Bipartisan Climate Solutions Caucus, which he co-chairs. Senator Todd Young currently serves on the committees on finance, foreign relations, small business and entrepreneurship, and commerce, science, and transportation, where he is a member of the subcommittee on oceans, fisheries, climate change, and manufacturing. And in the House, Representative Trey Hollingsworth serves on committees on investor protection, entrepreneurship and capital markets, housing, community development and insurance, and financial technology and artificial intelligence task forces. So thank you all for joining us today, and thank you for taking the point on this important effort to curb climate change. And let's begin by taking a minute each to give a high-level overview of your work in the climate space. Senator Young, let's start with you.
Well, thanks so much. Thank you to the Nature Conservancy and of course, to John Ketzenberger for his leadership and for all the others who are tuning in. It's great to be here with my colleagues, Senator Braun and Congressman Hollingsworth. I introduced some legislation which we have billed, the Conservation and Innovative Climate Partnership Act, last month. The bill bridges the divide between the innovative research taking place at our great land-grant institutions on one hand, and those who farm for a living by helping family farms adopt climate-friendly strategies like planting cover crops and using no-till practices. Every farmer faces unique decisions in management of their particular piece of ground. And they face pressure from the federal government to cut carbon emissions. So this can place stress on the good work that they already have underway. So the Conservation and Innovative Climate Partnership Act is going to support Hoosier farmers and others across this country looking to adopt innovative climate practices on their farms, by giving them access to the latest tools and research so that they can be successful. The bill will help increase the voluntary adoption of conservation practices, knowing that some farmers are apprehensive adopting these conservation practices. And the tools we use are public awareness campaigns, workshops, and the sort of specialized technical assistance that for years and generations we've seen delivered through cooperative extension through land grant universities in every state across the country. I'm proud to partner with Senator Braun on his Growing Climate Solutions Act, which will help farmers navigate the emerging activity in carbon markets. And lastly, there's a piece of legislation that we'll actually begin considering with full vigor on the floor of the U.S. Senate tomorrow, called the Endless Frontier Act, and it increases research and development and commercialization activities significantly in some identified areas, including battery storage, including green energy technologies, and advanced manufacturing, which of course makes us more efficient. All of those things will have a very direct positive impact on carbon emission reduction. So there's bipartisan support for all of these efforts, and I know that Senator Braun will speak to other bipartisan efforts, as will Congressman Hollingsworth.
Thank you very much, Senator Young. And you mentioned Representative Hollingsworth. I'd like to switch to him because I know that he has a commitment here in a little bit that will require him to leave us a little earlier. So, Representative Hollingsworth, would you take a minute to talk about what you're doing in this space?
Absolutely. And again, I join my colleagues in being delighted to be here. Thank you for hosting this. Thanks for the opportunity to talk about these issues. First and foremost, hats off to both Braun and Young for the tremendous leadership they've shown across the state and in the Senate on this very important issue. As I continue to travel the district and talk with farmers, talk with researchers, talk with businesses, and talk with Hoosiers across the district, I continue to hear that they want a strong, vibrant economy, but also a safe, well-protected environment. And for those people that believe we can either have one or the other, I would point to the many achievements this country has been able to gain by virtue of developing a symbiotic relationship between private sector and the public sector at the same time. And I think this is a perfect example of an opportunity that we can achieve our most laudable aims by ensuring that there's a strong partnership, that we incentivize the right behavior by both consumers and businesses, but also we make the investments that Senator Young just talked about in our technology to ensure that it's keeping pace with the needs of our economy, the needs of our citizens, but also the needs of the environment. I've been a champion on this side of the Capitol of ensuring that we don't talk about this as a one size fits all across the country, as one technology over another, but instead as an opportunity for us to develop the next generation of greener technologies, greener companies, along with a robust and strong economy that supports Hoosier families. So thanks so much for having me here.
Oh, it's a pleasure. Thank you. And I hope you can be here for just a few minutes for the first question. Senator Braun, we'll have you hit in the third slot here and take us into the Q&A after you've had a chance to give us an overview.
So I think it's a testament to the importance of the issue when you have both senators and a congressman here to talk about it. And I'm glad both of them are engaged in the issue. I'm interested in it because I've been a part of agriculture for over 30 some years, 35 as a tree farmer, involved in row crop ag side of it for probably over 25 to 30 years. And it's been an interest prior to coming to the Senate. And also been a really devoted conservationist, practicing all of that on land. The first 100 acres I started with that I live upon, and acreage I added to it and around the neighborhood. To give you a little flavor for how big the issue is, in just the year and a half that I've been here as part of the Senate Climate Caucus, it's moved in such a big way from, I'll never forget the first discussion, Mitt Romney at one side, talking to climate entrepreneurs, and the idea of pricing came up, and I thought our tax, our fee, whatever you want to call it, Mitt about bolded the meeting. And in the time since then, every CEO that is a stakeholder in climate, from electric generation, transportation, the two big ones, industrial emitters, concrete and steel, the two biggest within that group, agriculture, which our footprint is lower here in the U.S. By almost 60% compared to the world due to what we already do as good stewards of the land. But been a big move in terms of interest across the spectrum of stakeholders and even in how you approach it. Thanks to the Nature Conservancy, been a member of it as an individual and a corporate member for years. I think you're on to something. It also brings in young conservatives. They have been probably the most vocal supporters of being tuned into the issue. Farmers, because their livelihoods depend upon it. Even faith-based, from Catholics to evangelicals, among a host of others. So couldn't be, in my opinion, on more of a leading edge issue. I spent most of the rest of my time here on tackling what I started long ago too, reforming the healthcare industry. And all I can tell you, that's a stubborn bunch of players there that don't want to do anything to fix the status quo. Big part of our economy, bigger than what all the players I just mentioned would be on the energy transportation side of things. So good news is we're moving. We got a bill with 47 senators on it, one more Republican than a Democrat on a climate bill, the Growing Climate Solutions Act. Todd's got a good bill. We're going to see a lot of movement there. So a lot of progress. We're just beginning, and I think it's important. I view it as issue that's gone from the back burner to the front burner at a quick speed in a short period of time.
Yeah, we certainly are grateful for the movement and the leadership by all of you on this call, and are pleased that you're willing to take some time and talk about it with us and help maybe even accelerate that progress a little quicker. One thing the pandemic has shown us, we're all interconnected. And climate is a similar issue in that what happens here is affecting, countries across the globe and vice versa. So we'll have a big task, but hopefully we're all up to it. So with that, I'll begin to ask a few questions. I'll begin with you, Representative Hollingsworth. And it's really fairly straightforward. I want to hear what you're hearing from people in your district, from farmers about the climate challenge. And how do you respond to that? How do you encourage them who may be skeptics, and how do you encourage those who are wanting to move faster?
Well, it's a great question, and frankly, it's a very timely question because I spent all of last week traveling the district, meeting with different Hoosier groups, one of whom was the Farm Bureau. I had another farm roundtable separate from that, and had an agriculture discussion in town hall even later than that. And the one thing that came out of that really surprised me was that farmers don't view this as a challenge that they aren't willing to accept. What they said uniformly was, we can be a part of the solution here. Don't think of us as part of the problem. Think of us as part of the solution. And as Senator Braun already said, we've made tremendous strides in this country, not only with farm productivity, but farm conservation over the last 50 to 70 years. We can continue that great progress, but ensuring that best practices get out there to our farmers. They are dying for more information, more programs, more permits, more opportunities to learn how they can do better, not only to improve yield, not only to improve productivity, but also to improve conservation and lower their carbon footprint. That's what I heard over and over again, is get out more information to us, help us be even better stewards. And that's exactly what I bring up to Washington, D.C. when I get on the plane every Monday, is this sense that farmers across our communities are some of the best stewards of their land that you're ever going to meet. Frequently in DC, it sounds like it's farmers that are standing in the way of progress with regard to climate, but that is not what I see back home in district. I continue to hear from farmers across the district that want to be a part of the solution, that recognize that there's a problem, that recognize that they have been doing this for the last 70 years, being stewards of their land and being stewards of the next generation that might have that land. And so making sure we include them as a part of this. And that's why I applaud the work that Senator Braun has done in Glowing Climate Solutions. I applaud the work that Senator Young has done trying to bring this collaborative effort, not only from the farmers, but also from the research angle. So it's something that it's a dialogue when we're out in district, not only hearing from them about what are the challenges that stand in the way of them prevailing over this, but also how can we bring the best information back from our researchers, not only in DC, but across the country, so that they can participate. So.
Thank you. Senator Braun, what are you hearing from folks about that?
So I hear constantly from farmers because it's kind of the one thing I can still keep in touch with, along with being a U.S. Senator, because of the passive nature of the activity. And I've got all those relationships still there. They are looking at a business that's gotten riskier and riskier, higher altitude in terms of the costs of doing business. Corn and soybeans in just 15 years probably cost 2.5 to 3 times as much to actually put out there, variable inputs per acre. And the bottom line, until just last year, there had been not a real profit in the market since 2013. So it was starting to look like, something again that has beset farming cyclically. And they see their stewardship as being one way to add to their bottom line when it's so difficult to do that in an even keeled basis over time. So looks like markets are going to be good, exceptionally good in 2021. Who knows about 2022? Farmers are always great at the skill of producing with fewer inputs, by the way, in many cases. Cited earlier, the footprint of agriculture in terms of CO2 emissions, 25% across the rest of the world, because so much of the rest of the world would be agrarian economies. You take away China, India, European Union, Australia, Japan, those last 3 have been doing a decent job of lowering their CO2 footprint. The rest of it is primarily going to fall upon the backs of farmers in many other countries that percentage-wise aren't the stewards that U.S. farmers are. So they're aware of that. They know that they lead, and they're really starving for anything that's going to help add a little bit of a cushion to their difficult bottom line year after year. And when you tell them it's only 15 to 30 bucks, maybe an acre, with these voluntary markets that are already out there that we're trying to match them up with through the Growing Climate Solutions Act, that's an hallelujah for a normal year. That'll either take their loss to a break even or maybe make money where they wouldn't have otherwise. They're excited about it.
And understandably so. I think that's a proper approach to the effort here because it does involve everybody. Senator Young, your thoughts on this? What are you hearing from people in across the state?
Well, I'm thinking of the ag community in particular because we've been discussing them, and I'll tell you, for a period of time when I first began serving in elective office, I heard more skepticism about the origins of climate change, about whether or not it was happening, and so forth. And there's a lot less of that right now. And I don't hear a lot of alarmism, but there's some of that. So in between there, I think is where the vast majority of opinions lie among our agricultural community and probably more broadly among Hoosiers. I think most Hoosiers believe that we should have a scientific and economic response to addressing the concerns of climate change. We should act, but we should act in a manner consistent with science and with good economics. I came to this conclusion more broadly about the environment, which is sort of consistent with the Nature Foundation's philosophy. Years ago, I read a book that made a significant impact on my thinking. It was called Ecocide in the USSR. I read it when I was at the Naval Academy in the early 90s. But it talks about how centralized planned economies can really destroy economic growth and prosperity and really crush dreams. And instead, more efficient, market-driven solutions tend to lead to not just more prosperity, but also a cleaner environment. An environment in this instance where the climate will not be adversely impacted moving forward, or one in which we can mitigate the extent to which it changes in significant ways on account of human activity. So, in short, we don't need to destroy our economy to protect our environment. And this was reaffirmed recently. I read a book which I also found compelling. I'd be open to any critical feedback, but it was written by one of the authors of the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change reports. It's called Apocalypse Never, and I'm sure some of your viewers have read it. And it too calls for a balance between economic growth and innovation and government sort of overseeing environmental protection. So what I've learned from my study on this issue, I'm always open to more counsel, is that before we take potentially disruptive steps that might punish consumers or businesses, we need to fully understand the economic impacts of doing so. And then when we take steps that might cause some measure of disruption in the short term, we also need to make sure that we provide, say, farmers with the tools to actually adjust to the new normal. So we neither want to be a market fundamentalist or a government fundamentalist. And though I'm not hearing Hoosiers characterize their climate position exactly those words, I think that's the policy that they want. We've always been, as James Madison, the author and historian of Indiana, puts it, we're the riverboat captains, we Hoosiers who like to kind of go down the center of the river, neither too far right or too far left. Otherwise, we get caught up on one of the shoals.
I think Jim Madison would be happy he's quoted in a conversation like this, and maybe
I think he'd be shocked, actually, but
he might be a little astonished.
Yeah.
But I think that does raise a very important point. And nature has a way of balancing on its own, and I think that we need to find that balance. And the fact that we're having a discussion like this, where we are talking about solutions as opposed to debating the underlying question, is encouraging, but also shows that we have a ways to go. But end of my editorial comment. I appreciate your indulgence on that. Let's talk a little bit about the fact that your legislation has attracted bipartisan support, bipartisan activity, and I think that's an important component of that balance that you spoke of, Senator Young. So let's begin with you on this notion of bipartisanship and where it's at now, and what do you think it'll mean going forward for the issue?
So that's going to be the bumper sticker for this pandemic era. It's going to be, you are on mute, or am I on mute? So the Conservation and Innovative Climate Partnership Act, which we've dropped, S 1189, is something that Senator Braun has helped me introduce, along with Senator Smith and Schatz, the latter two being Democrats, and we introduced the bill in April. The legislation, which I've sort of described, enabling partnerships between land grant universities and local farmers to increase the uptake of conservation practices and innovative climate practices, allowing farmers to voluntarily adopt practices that suit their individualized needs, recognizing we believe over a period of time that to the extent they are adopting these conservation practices, their soil will be richer and their farms will be more productive. And then requiring land grant universities to continue to fulfill their public missions, which will include partnering with a nonprofit, state, or federal entity to participate in things like workshops and distribution of digital materials and tests to measure the effectiveness of conservation and the latest and greatest climate smart policies. So the money should not be a challenge. This would be an appropriation of $13 million in funding for 4-year grants with a maximum grant of $400,000. This is an investment in the public, in the future, in our collective, interests, and compared to a lot of the investments or spending that occurs up here, incredibly modest. So I'm really quite encouraged because we not only have bipartisan support on the Senate side. We've already been working this issue on the House side. Representatives Newhouse of Washington and Spanberger of Virginia, Republican and Democrat, have introduced it. I think Shelley Pingree, a Democrat of Maine, just joined. And we've seen broad, outside interest too from our land grant universities, including Purdue, to the corn growers, the soy growers, the Farm Bureau, the Agribusiness Council, many of the same groups that Senator Braun has done a great job of getting behind his legislation. And the Nature Conservancy has also endorsed this. I leave the best for last, and I think that this would be a fertile, no pun intended, a fertile piece of legislation to add as an amendment or in the base bill of the next ag bill that goes through.
That would be a great home for it, and give it a good opportunity to move forward and realize the benefits of that. So I hope that that's a good outcome for that. We're going to go to you, Senator Braun, for your response to that question. And just a heads up, after that, we're going to pivot to questions from our panelists that have joined us today. So, Senator, you want to bring us home on this question?
So when it comes to the bipartisan nature of this discussion, I think I engaged with Chris Coons on joining the Climate Caucus about midway through 2019, roughly. And then got 6 other Republicans to join. We were active discussing stakeholder issues. That's when I realized that there was such broad interest among the participants in the climate arena about being part of a solution. The bill itself was reintroduced this year, and we're now at 24 Republicans, 23 Democrats. So we're very close to getting near the 60 vote threshold, and I think we will get there soon. I think we just ran it on our hotline here to see if there was any conservative, any Republican against it. And we had a couple of my normal buddies and I that'll get on stuff for more information, and they came off. So we should be in good shape. And that's surprising to me when you look at kind of how difficult it is in general to get any kind of legislation, especially something with substance in it that leads in a critical category of discussion. So pleased with it. I think this is just where we begin, and who knows where it will go. So it's been uncharacteristically bipartisan in terms of the discussion, especially when my side of the aisle, Todd mentioned it earlier, we're still wrestling with maybe the science, not accepting it even as an issue. And we haven't overcome all of that, especially when you get the fossil fuel element. And that's a big, important contingent out there. And I think we need to tread carefully there. And I think what was attractive here with Todd's legislation in mind, it doesn't push too hard into those areas that are going to take a little more time, so that we don't lose ground by not letting that flesh itself out, letting my side of the aisle catch up with some of the broader discussions that may go beyond what we're talking about currently. So all in all, I'm pleased with where we're at, and it's got a really broad agricultural buy-in, which is, all conservation groups, mostly American Farm Bureau, ag dealers, just a host of people that play into the ag arena that are on board. So that's good news.
It is good news. And it's, again, that balance that you're talking about. You have to walk before you can run. So I'm glad that we're taking it as it comes. So now I'm going to invite the representatives from Indiana's ag sector to unmute their microphones and share their video for a Q&A opportunity with our members of our senators. Appearing on your screens are Bob White, who is the Director of Government Relations with the Indiana Farm Bureau, Jordan Sager, who is Deputy Director of the Indiana State Department of Agriculture, and Dr. Jeff Dukes, Director of the Climate Change Research Center at Purdue University. So welcome to you all, and thank you for being here. Jordan, let's start with you. Jordan, would you ask a question of the senators, please?
Absolutely. Thanks, John. And thanks to TNC for hosting and the delegation for the leadership. I think the both of you know that Indiana, through a large conservation partnership and a lot of work with multiple states, heavily engaged in longstanding water quality efforts. We drain in the Great Lakes, so big partnership there, and a big partnership draining into the Gulf of Mexico and working through the hypoxia challenges there. And when it comes to some of those longstanding water quality improvement efforts, how do we continue to make progress there, knowing we still got a lot more work to do when climate is really gaining a lot of traction and kind of the latest popular movement? And I'll maybe jump to Senator Braun first on that, please.
So hi, Jordan. Good to be discussing a topic I know that we both are very interested in. Let me discuss this very anecdotally, in the sense that I'm a big fisherman and hunter. And I remember 35 years ago when somebody invited me to go fishing in the White River, I wondered if I needed protective gear to do so. I never imagined that in such a short period of time, and ours would be, I guess, the east branch that flows through, maybe a little less challenged than the west branch would have been. But in that time, I know that things have improved there, and we've had a few issues that crop up where you get an industrial affluent getting into our waterways. But my goodness, how that has made a quantum leap. And I remember vividly as a kid, I think when I was back in high school, started the ecology club, and the Cuyahoga River started on fire, up in Ohio. Water quality, especially with agriculture being part of the issue there, trying to keep soil in the field. I know how riparian buffers, grass waterways, cover crops, all of that now is pretty well standard operating procedure for almost all farmers, even though they're farming their ground more intensively. So my observation is that we'd really have to backslide for that to go the other way. And I think with the whole idea that especially your generation, younger generations are as probably concerned about climate as they are healthcare. It could be a little bit your age, but I see it everywhere. And I think that involves not only air quality in terms of particulate matter, which we've largely kind of scrubbed out even on fossil fuels. CO2 emissions remain there. And I would hope that we're not backsliding when it comes to water quality. And I know that agriculture probably now disproportionately has more maybe room to improve than you'd find through industrial emitters, effluents that kept us from, swimming in a river or especially eating fish out of it. And I've been amazed at how quickly waterways can heal themselves, and have watched it year by year as I spend time in our own nearby river.
Thank you for that. I'm curious from you, Senator Young.
Well, Jordan, thank you for the question. I think aside from our human resources, our talent, our people in the state of Indiana, arguably our greatest natural resource is our soil. And that soil has been depleted in quality and in volume, right? Over a number of years because of certain farming practices in part, right? And recognizing that, I think lays a predicate for figuring out how to address runoff issues, because healthy soil, we've all seen, I think, the experiments. If you haven't, you should consult with the Natural Resource Conservation Service of the U.S. Department of Agriculture. They'll do an experiment for you that shows you, and it's available online on YouTube as well, shows you healthy soil that absorbs a lot of moisture. And they'll show you clunky, dry soil, devoid of nutrients and devoid of channeling, little tunnels that are created by root systems and insects, and that healthy soil becomes unhealthy by modern agriculture practices, the over application and increased application of chemicals, by heavy tilling and other things that have led to great productivity. Don't get me wrong, but they come with a downside. And we've been through this before, the Dust Bowl, right? And so we really know, because of modern science conducted at places like Purdue University and so many other places, we know how to address this. And it's to return to some of the lessons that we can learn by looking at past agricultural practices and figuring out how to most effectively and with the least amount of risk, incorporating cover crops, no-till practices and other modern conservation practices into our agriculture. So how does all that relate to what the Nature Conservancy has done in Indiana? Well, if you're retaining the moisture in Indiana's soil, you get less runoff, and it doesn't find its way ultimately through tributaries and down our rivers into the Gulf of Mexico and lead to that hypoxia situation that results in all sorts of adverse effects like fish kills and other things that we should all care about.
Senator, thank you. And you've just described a lot of our work from, say, Fort Wayne to Evansville. So
yes,
appreciate it.
You're most welcome.
Let's move. We've got two more questions, and we're running a little short, but hopefully we can get them both in here. I'm going to jump to Jeff Dukes at Purdue, and we'll get Bob in here just at the nick of time.
That's great. Thanks, John, and hello, senators. Thanks for being on today. My question is, it's sort of a what else question. So you have introduced legislation that helps us understand and address this intersection between agriculture and climate change. And we've talked a little bit today about a carbon fee, just sort of tangentially mentioned that as a possible sort of future route to this. As we know, though, the climate challenge is much bigger than we can address with just the agriculture sector, or even with a carbon fee of any like politically reasonable size that we're likely to put on this. And it's much bigger than we can just address here in the United States as well, of course. So I wonder, when you're thinking about this, what do you think are the next steps beyond that the federal government can take in some way, that you can take, that can really help us address this meaningfully on a global scale? How do we scale up our our efforts here to really fully address this challenge that we know is big. And as Senator Braun said, maybe, it could take a while to walk some people on your side of the aisle along towards some of these solutions. But what do you see as the path forward, I guess?
So
go ahead. Well, I'll try and keep it tight, which is hard for we senators sometimes, Mike. But so thank you, Dr. Dukes. Two thoughts, two reflections. Recognizing the global nature of the challenge, which you alluded to, Doctor. I think we need to work with partner and allied countries all around the world to develop the next generation of science and technology to improve our modular nuclear reactors. Perhaps we'll be investing in those in fairly short order. And the multitude of other energy saving technologies and energy producing technologies and energy storing technologies that can help us sustainably address this issue while still ensuring that we can all be prosperous. So how do you crowd in other countries, crowd in their talent, crowd in some of their funding in order to achieve that? I've tried to come up with a vehicle which we will consider through the Endless Frontier Act. I think that would address kind of the global dimension of this. I don't pretend that any one piece of legislation is going to be a panacea for this. That's why Senator Braun's leadership on this and that of others is really important. But that's how I'm thinking through this issue. It's a diplomatic issue in addition to a scientific issue and a business issue and consumer issue.
So I think Todd did a great job there of citing the three dynamics within the discussion. There's a big question, and it gets very political quickly. You know what we've done on our waterways in terms of that trajectory since the late 60s. We've done an excellent job of pulling particulate matter out of our air. We've been on a CO2 emissions trajectory, which is good. It still stacks us up as the biggest carbon emitter per capita, the second largest absolutely. And soon China is going to eclipse us by leaps and bounds on absolute emissions. And I think India will as well. So the thing that bothers me the most, and of course, politically, it got caught up in the Paris Climate Accord, is I really think we're out there doing a lot of things that's putting our money where our mouth is, both government and especially stakeholders within industry. When I look at who's going to solve it, I don't think it's going to come from government. Todd hit on it a little bit. It's going to be advanced nuclear technology. It's going to be hydrogen fuel cells. It's going to be something we may not even be aware of that comes into play because it's not going to be through government. Already, there's a wrestling match between folks that are interested in pricing carbon or having a fee. Generally, though, it's in the discussion of being in lieu of regulation. And I know the other side of the aisle is not interested in lifting regulations, hoping that, we'll have industry carry the load, solve the issue on kind of the honor system, so to speak. So there are a lot of moving parts to it, but I think how we end up being neutral by 2040, 2050, some have aspired to doing it by 2030, is going to take government to be in the mix, especially ours. How much of it's done by example that shames others into doing the same thing? How much the consequences of not doing it start to catch up with us in terms of evidence beyond the modeling that's probably been off a little bit, and nothing's been swamped yet on the coast. You never know when that does cross a threshold and give us, that further indication that we need to do more. And I'm hoping of the three, pricing versus regulation, that's going to be a difficult political conversation. I have no idea how the rest of the world, other than I think the European Union, I think Japan, I think Australia, and I think the US is actually putting its money where its mouth is, both within their private economies and their government. And I'm hoping that innovation and technology gives us that really even carbon capture. Not everybody is given up on trying to do that directly out of the air. The fossil fuel industry would still love to be in play if you'd find an effective, cost-effective way to capture carbon that makes sense to where you can use that strategic fuel source. Politically, that gets dicey because some want that to exit stage left quickly and have the end of the discussion. A lot of moving parts. I think that those are the mix of variables, and I don't think we've ever been more into the conversation in terms of the real consequences of not doing something and different elements starting to weigh in. It'll be interesting to see how it pans out.
Indeed. I know we're right up against it, but I do want to give Bob White from the Indiana Farm Bureau a chance to ask a question, if you don't mind. So, Bob?
Thanks, John. Thank you, both senators, for introducing legislation and being such an advocate on climate change in agriculture. Both of your bills will require some funding, and as we've discussed, a lot of research still needs to be done in that particular arena. In regard to what farming practices for our farmers are absolutely the best. And to capture carbon, to sequester that, and reduce our emissions. So what have you done? As you both know, you can authorize a lot of different things, but the appropriators handle the purse. And so where do we stand on funding for that? And then, in part, how are both your bills going to impact the discussions going into the next farm bill that will start in all likelihood this fall?
Can I give 30 seconds, Mike, and then I'll leave more time for you. With respect to the appropriators, one step at a time. I'm trying to get through an energy research bill, and then which authorizes a significant amount of money, and then we'll focus on the appropriators. But I'll be making the same case to them that I'm making to many of my fellow colleagues, and we need more outside groups, frankly, to ask the appropriators to appropriate needed monies. And then with respect to actually, changing the landscape of things, I think what I'm trying to do, and I sense this is what Mike's trying to do as well, is broaden the coalition of support around smart conservation policies that can earn the support of everyone from strong conservatives to progressives, and offer value propositions to all of them. So I think that'll be an effect of these bills. Yeah. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Senator Young.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Yes, sir.
So when it comes to Todd, I think described that very well. I'll put a little larger kind of view on what's going to get difficult when it comes to appropriations. Todd's bill, even the Endless Frontier, his climate bill, those are small impacts when it comes to the way we throw around trillions now, used to be billions. And it is a big issue. A lot of it can be gotten from like reforming healthcare. That's probably the biggest mine of savings that would be out there if we could get that industry to start doing what it needs to do. And otherwise, sadly, we're in a pickle of where we're borrowing everything that we're doing that's new. So I still look for pay-fors like offsets, and that's not in years 6 through 10. That's out of the gate where you're taking current spending. Of course, I'm not very popular, and now I'm an appropriator. I'll be the Debbie Downer of appropriators possibly, and you'll have to make those judgments, and you're never going to get to the purity of where I'd like to see the federal government be, and that is at least start for future generations, putting it out there that we're not mindlessly just marching into the future borrowing from our kids and our grandkids. And that is more than something I think that is just a theoretical argument. I argued with Bernie Sanders on the floor of the Senate last week. You can't justify all this with the modern monetary theory, which basically dismisses deficits and debt. Bigger discussion. We'll always find ways, I hope, to prioritize the most important stuff, try to put a little bit of fiscal discipline in it, and then know that to get some things across, the Growing Climate Solutions Act is technically revenue neutral, other than a small, maybe administrative cost to get the portal set up for certification, because we're tapping voluntary markets. Todd's bills involve very little compared to some of the stuff we're talking about currently. Where that all ends up in the short run, how it impacts our country in the long run, that remains to be seen. That's a complicated discussion.
Thank you, Senator.
Yes, thank you very much, Senator. I appreciate that. And this is the point where we're going to pivot. So thank you for being with us today, and thank you for your leadership on the climate issues. And we look forward to working with you more as we go forward. So I hope you have a good rest of the day.
Okay, my pleasure. Thank you.
Okay, for everyone else who is still with us, and we're pleased to have them, the second part of our program is we'll turn our attention away from Washington and back to Indiana for our discussion of the ways in which we can, our agriculture producers are stepping up to address the effects and impacts of a changing climate. But I want to reintroduce our panel first, and I'll start with where we finished in the first half there with Bob White. Bob's the Director of National Government Relations for the Indiana Farm Bureau, where he advocates for the interests of Indiana's farmers in Washington, D.C. Bob was appointed by President George W. Bush as the Indiana State Director for the USDA Rural Development, and during his tenure, he brought billions of dollars to rural Indiana projects, including water conservation. He also served as a senior professional staff member on the Senate Ag Committee, where he worked on 6 farm bills. 6 farm bills. I can't even imagine. Bob earned his bachelor's and master's degrees in science of agriculture mechanization from Purdue, and he owns and manages a farm in Pulaski County, which has been in his family for more than 160 years. So, Bob, we're pleased to have you with us. Jordan Sager is the Deputy Director of the Indiana State Department of Agriculture. He has served the department for more than 10 years. Many of them have been focused on soil and water conservation efforts. And prior to joining the department, Jordan worked for the National Park Service in Maine and Alaska, a couple of really boring places, where he conducted air and water quality monitoring, as well as the Department of Defense, another boring place, in Washington, D.C. I'm glad you came back home, Jordan, and got to this interesting stuff. Jordan graduated from IU with a bachelor's degree in public affairs, and he grew up in Jasper, Senator Braun's neck of the woods, and was involved with his family's poultry operation. So, Jordan, thank you for being with us today. And then we have Dr. Jeff Dukes, who directs the Purdue Climate Change Research Center and is a professor in Purdue's Department of Forestry and Natural Resources and Biological Sciences. He holds the Belcher Chair for Environmental Sustainability in the College of Ag. Dr. Dukes' research examines how plants and ecosystems respond to a changing environment, focusing on topics from invasive species to climate change. Much of his experimental work seeks to inform and improve climate models. Dr. Dukes received a PhD from Stanford University and a bachelor's degree from Brown University, both in biological sciences. He has been elected a fellow and named a public engagement fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, and he is a fellow of the Ecological Society of America. As the director of the Purdue Climate Change Research Center, he has led the Indiana Climate Change Impacts Assessment, and we are very pleased that Dr. Dukes is with us today. So that's our panel for the second half of the discussion here. I'm going to skip down to our second question that we had developed here. And it's that we know that Hoosier farmers can and will adapt to Indiana's changing climate. And innovations are already underway, as we've discussed in the first part of the discussion here. But ag has a significant role to play in avoiding even greater impacts. Natural and working lands absorb 12% of the U.S. greenhouse gas emissions. Where are the real opportunities for farmers to increase these numbers and reduce emissions? emissions, and what are some of the steps, some of the barriers rather, that farmers face in taking those steps? So Jordan, I'll come to you first on this role in mitigation for agriculture, if you will.
Yeah, John, thank you for the question. Again, great to be here and join an excellent panel. We'll just say that, looking at the numbers, 83% of Indiana is in private farms and forests. The vast majority of that being privately owned. And these acres are already a carbon sink in many cases, especially on the forest land. And with some adjustments to management practices, we've talked a lot about soil health this afternoon, can be even a larger carbon sink. So we're very proud that this collective partnership in Indiana, really led by Hoosier farmers themselves, this past year in 2020 actually installed a record number of soil health conservation practices, over 32,000. So that kind of gives you an idea of where their mindsets and where the trends are going. We're very proud to be part of it. On the row crop side, just real quick, the potential kind of for greater sink, looking across greenhouse gas emissions, with infield practices, it's those increase in soil health practices like reducing tillage, cover crops, improving nutrient management. It's where some of the biggest gains can be had. On the edge of field side of things, filter strips, wetland construction, reforesting marginal acres potentially, or large potential. And then lastly, on the livestock side, looking at greenhouse gas emissions, big potential with looking at feed additions, also looking at sourcing more sustainably grown feed or ingredients, a lot of that grown right here in Indiana. And then on the livestock, looking at structural adjustments like converting to renewable energy, improving waste management, thinking kind of like manure digesters as an example.
Thanks a lot, Jordan. Bob, you want to take a crack at that?
Well, thanks a lot, John. Jordan said a lot of great things, and Indiana farmers have been doing that for quite a while. The conservation partnership in Indiana has been strong for the past 3 decades, and it is unique to Indiana. Many other states do not have that organizational intuitiveness, maybe to get along, so to speak. And we have. It's been a great partnership, and that is the way that a lot of the things that Jordan mentioned has been getting done. The problem we have is that not everybody's doing it for whatever reason. So we have to delve into the educational side, get more of our farmers on board. You can see the field behind my house. Basically, he had a cover crop in it all winter long. It did not blow and erode, and he went in and no-tilled it with a burn down. And then right down the road, you'll see without a conservation cover crop, and then it will blow the dust when high wind comes in the winters, and you wonder why the difference between the two mentalities, because one is conserving soil, getting greater soil tilth, soil health, and that in response to that, typically will get a greater yield and return on investment for that farmer. So we've got to get more of our farmers on board to the tactics that basically Jordan explained. We're doing a lot of great things. We just need to get some more folks on board and figure out what the mentality is not to do those. And if it is funding, going back to that, farmers will do a lot of different things for a lot of different reasons, but when it hits their cash flow in a positive way, they will always take a look at it and try it out. And hopefully they do it right. In order to get that return on their investment, they will always do the right thing.
It's always a powerful incentive, and they act as any other business would act, and you can't blame them for that. So
Yeah, and
those are the conditions.
one of the primary issues that the conservation partnership has always pushed is voluntary and incentive based, and that works. It works well.
That's been our experience, and we see it with cover crops. We'd like 4 or 5 times what we have, but we're already in a pretty good spot in terms of the use of cover crops in Indiana. So we've got more to do, but we'll see if we can get that adoption. Jeff?
Yeah, well, I mean, these guys set it up so nicely. I mean, Jordan nailed all the main categories. It's, how do you manage your inputs so that you minimize the nitrous oxide gases coming off your field? It's how do you, put on cover crops and no-till so you keep the carbon in the fields or build up the carbon that's in the soil and keep that soil health. How do you manage the livestock so that you minimize the methane coming out of them? Give them some sort of food additive to minimize it. And that's still an evolving technology, but that's coming down the road. And how do you manage the waste from the livestock and the other animals to minimize the methane and nitrous oxide that's coming out of that part of the operation, and maybe recapture some of it, maybe actually generate some energy with it. I mean, those are the some of the critical things that people can do. I think when you look across the fields and you see the differences, like Bob was just talking about, you can't help but scratch your head and say, well, why are some of the farmers, probably everybody who's on this call, why are they all doing the right thing? Whereas maybe some of these other people aren't seeing the incentives. And I think one of the challenges that we've got to recognize here in Indiana and throughout the Midwest is there's so many people who don't own the land that they're farming, right? Who are renting that land. And so you have really different incentives for the people who own their land than the people who don't necessarily own the land. And maybe the owners are off somewhere completely different and have no idea what's going on that parcel of land. And so I think that's one of the challenges that we face here, is to make sure that the people who are operating the land have and see that incentive to do the right thing for it. And so I just think that's a disconnect that's critical, that we've got to be thinking about all the time when we're thinking about how to build in incentives to basically farm in a way that's smarter for our climate.
Thank you. I agree. So we've heard from our federal representatives, and you all represent the state and local interests. And I want to ask you about that particular role. What is that role for state and local governments and resources such as the ag extension and universities to support climate change mitigation through ag, the natural resource conservation, the things that we've been talking about? And how can we get all of these levels of government working better together? So I'll start with you, Jeff, because you just finished it up, and we'll work our way back to Jordan to clean this one up. So what's your response to that on the local and state government, Jeff?
Yeah, I think that local and state governments, and maybe particularly state governments, can just try to make it easier for farmers. And there was a bill in the most recent sort of round of State House negotiations here that didn't make it through, but that was trying to set up essentially something like a farmers market that Indiana farmers and forest landowners could potentially use to get hooked up with buyers of carbon credits and basically make it easier for them to figure out how to make some money by doing the right thing. I think that's a one relatively straightforward thing that state governments can do in the absence of a similar federal mechanism to make it a little bit easier for farmers to do that. But I think being information providers is certainly a first step. Other states that are really trying to manage their own emissions, they may provide direct incentives to buy carbon credits, locally more than we're doing here in Indiana. California's got a market, but that doesn't seem like something that's going to happen in the short term here. So I think being connectors, being sort of brokers, or helping helping set people up is a good role in the short term in the absence of that.
We were big supporters of Senate Bill 373, and it was a good bill, a nice start to maybe bringing some organization to what could be the Wild West when it comes to those carbon credits for forest and row crop acres. But it got caught up in another political battle and ended up, failing altogether, unfortunately. But I do believe that they're going to have a task force on that, and maybe we can create some of those conditions that you were talking about there, Jeff. But Bob, you've seen this, this cycle before too, in the other areas that we discussed earlier, like water conservation and the soil conservation efforts over time. Are there analogies here? Are there things that could be done that aren't being done, or what do you see?
Well, I'll take it back to the educational aspect of it all. The conservation partnership, you've got NRCS that from a federal level does great work on research, a lot of research. And of course, they know all the different government programs. You've got the Department of Soil Conservation in the state. And then at the local level, you've also got the soil water districts. And so the education that flows, and those folks meet regularly and talk about what each of them are doing. What can you do? What can I do? What I cannot do? Maybe the other agency can. And they get the word out really, really very well. And they do a good job of demonstration plots. Here's what we've done here. Here's going back to the YouTube video that Senator Young talked about with the NRCS and the filtration between a cover crop and not having a cover crop, those types of things. And when farmers see that hands-on, it makes a difference. And then they try it. Most of them will try it in a small way on their farm, and then they will incorporate that into their own management plans. And that's one of the best ways that we've worked in the past, specifically with non-point source pollution back 25, 30 years ago. That was the primary way that we solved those issues. Now, John, as you mentioned earlier, we've got a long ways to go on a lot of these issues. However, we're steadily moving forward. And that's what we need to continue to do, get more people involved in the process. And like Dr. Dukes mentioned, we do have that disconnect. There are a lot of absentee landlords out there. Sometimes the incentive isn't there for the renter farmer to make those changes because it may decrease his profit on that particular piece of property. And so I'm not quite sure what the answer is, but collectively, I think we can get the job done. And we've done a great job in Indiana, and we should always remember that. We are ahead of that game than many other states are, just because of that concerted effort that we've made to get along together with the Conservation Partnership.
It seems like it's a very practical relationship and one that understands, there's a solution to be had. Let's figure it out. And you really identified one with the difference between the farmer and the landowner in many cases. About half the acres that are tillable in the state are owned by people who don't actually put a plow in the ground. So, that's a big issue and one that requires working through. Jordan, how do you see this from your perch?
Yeah, and I agree with my fellow panel members, and we'll just build upon Bob's comments there in really looking at a competitive advantage for the state, if you will. If the world is changing and trends are moving, the West and the Southwest are drying up where a lot of high value specialty crops are grown. How does our state best compete in the new norm, if you will, utilizing that conservation ethic and the partnerships that we've already had a foundation for, for decades? We also know there's an evolving food supply chain. that's focused on combating climate change. So how does our state best compete in this new space? All those things given. We have water. And again, you don't need to read too much of the news to see what's happening out west continually, where a lot of specialty crops are being grown. We're also the crossroads of the nation. And the facts show that we are in Indiana one day access to 80% of the population. So think about that factoid when the food supply chain starts looking at greenhouse gas emissions in the transportation system. And as we've talked throughout this, we have farmers who've been doing conservation before it was cool. And thankfully, we have a lot of the data to back that up and trends. We've been tracking this stuff for decades that probably not any other state has that kind of hard data that can show progress and trends and real change. So, the question that kind of evolves a little bit is can we substantiate ag products, whether they're grown or raised in Indiana in this new world, are being raised actually more sustainably here, given that maybe we have better access to water, we have that conservation ethic, and we have a competitive advantage just where we sit in the middle of the country when it comes to moving things around the state and to hungry mouths.
Thank you, Jordan. I want to go back to the conversation and the legislation that Senator Braun was talking about, the Growing Climate Solutions Act. And, a lot of this is aimed at farmers for, their voluntary carbon market programs. What are you hearing, Bob, from Indiana's farmers, and how have they responded to the legislation? We had we had the legislation in Indiana that we mentioned earlier. And then the other aspect of this that I think is very interesting is scalability. How do we ensure that farmers who are not of a large scale can participate on equal footing with farmers who do, or the big corporations that have these kinds of operations? What are your thoughts on that, Bob?
Well, currently, I've heard from a lot of farmers with regard to the private companies that are out there. There's at least 8 to 10, depending on which ones you look at. And you described it earlier, the carbon market is essentially the wild, wild west as we know it. Entry-level acres can be anywhere from 5 acres up to minimum of 1,000 acres. So that's going to differentiate your players immediately right there. There's different numbers associated. There's different ways that are going to be to prove that farmer is doing what they're doing. Contracts, it's crazy. It's similar to what the wind and the solar contracts were maybe 10 years ago. I think that Senator Braun's bill, when we worked with him last year on that, one of the things that he wanted to do was to maybe stabilize that market, because each one of those different private companies has a different certification system, a different type of management. You're going to have to do other things in order to enter their space. You have to keep data, and you're only going to get maybe $25 or maybe $10, but it's going to take you $30 worth of work per acre in order to get that done. They're not going to buy into it right away. The reliability of the market isn't there. Now, Truterra, basically, which is part of Land O'Lakes, has a $100 million Microsoft contract. So their funding is there. They aren't going out on the private market. But the variation in the technical aspects of what you have to do in order to qualify is different in each one. And it was mentioned earlier on the call about, I think Jordan mentioned it, we don't want to backslide on the water and the nutrient management. two of those programs, I think, incorporate nutrient trading, which basically is new, is just almost as new as the carbon market. And so there's a lot of things to be careful about at this particular point in time when it comes to that marketplace. And guys are calling me and, they're saying, well, should I sign a 10-year contract? And I said, well, I'm not an attorney. However, I would advise you not to sign a 10-year contract, because next year this whole market is going to, in all likelihood, look very different because of what's going on at the federal level.
And that's a hard thing for people who try to look further into the calendar than, next week or even next year. So
yeah,
that's a tough calculation. And that's why I think bringing some order to the market would be helpful.
Correct.
Gordon, how do you see it?
Was that a pivot to me, John?
Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, how would you
agree with Bob's perspective there? And, I would just add some of the big questions we're hearing is what's the baseline, right? Will only new actions count towards any goals? So we've been talking all along about, the good conservation ethic here in Indiana. Well, if someone's been no-till and cover cropping already, will they be able to enter into some of these markets? There's also another piece of, who's first in line to benefit. Is this more of a corporate sustainability goal, motivation, or, is this a product premium that could be passed along to a farmer? Is the farmer first in line to benefit? So a lot of discussions there. And, just lastly, I would add, and Dr. Dukes, I'm sure, is the expert here, but the greenhouse gas picture in confronting the climate change challenge is larger than just carbon. When you start looking at methane and nitrous oxide, nitrous oxide, for example, 300 times more potent, than carbon. If the motivation really is climate change and combating that challenge, the conversation probably will eventually, I would imagine, broaden beyond just carbon. And you can, we can have the discussion here for hours of where potential is with ag and source or sink, but I think it's pretty clear that when it comes to carbon, it's more of a potential to be a sink with ag. That gets a little trickier when you start looking at methane and nitrous oxide.
All right. Thank you, Jordan. Dr. Dukes, I want to, in the interest of time, get one more question in. So feel free to maybe roll in your response to that last question to your answer to this one. So we'll come to you first. And it's about renewable energy. High and fluctuating energy costs can cause economic challenges for many of Indiana's farmers. And as they seek ways to reduce their energy use and increase efficiency, they're turning to renewable energy sources that were mentioned earlier: wind, solar, biofuels. Can you speak to the mutual benefits in the ag industry to clean energy sector and vice versa?
Sure, absolutely. I mean, ag uses a bunch of energy, and especially if you're drying grain or something like that, there's a lot of energy you need, and they also have the potential to generate a lot of energy, a lot of electricity off those lands, whether it's from having wind turbines on them or solar panels. And I think that we're getting better at figuring out how to integrate the two. And there's a lot of work to be done on that front as well, and figuring out how to do things like grow crops and collect solar energy at the same time. And that's work that's ongoing at Purdue, among other institutions. But I think there's a clear benefit in that to farmers, in that one of the biggest challenges of farming is that you don't know what your income is going to be from year to year, right? But with renewable energy, if you're using your land to generate renewable energy, you've got a much better idea of exactly what kind of income you're going to get off of that activity. So at least for the landowners, it's a real option of bringing in a more stable income and a pretty good one on a per acre basis from those activities. All kinds of political hurdles that need to be overcome, I think, to see it proliferate across the state and see more farmers able to benefit from it. But it seems like a really clear win for the climate and win for the farmers' pocketbooks if they, in many cases, if they want to take that on. And I want to just back up for 1 second to some of your previous questions as to, what can we do at the state level to help some of these technologies, including renewables, but the various climate-friendly practices sort of make it onto farms and help farmers benefit from doing these things. I'd say one other thing we can do is think about supporting our extension programs and really help with that information flow. We're fortunate in Indiana to have a really good extension program run through Purdue, and only a small fraction of that is able to focus on climate change and energy issues at this point. But it's a place where there's a lot of need for this information right now to get out to the communities, as we've been talking about. And there are internal conversations within Purdue about how to make that happen. But I think, that's something that we could see more sort of state level support for as well.
That's a great point. And there are lots of channels for that information that we discussed. The soil and water conservation districts are another, the not-for-profit sector. So I think that the more information, the more understanding we get out there is better. And, that service has been, as you said, leading for a long time. So it's great to be able to draw on the extension service. Jordan, how do you see the issue of renewables and the intersection with folks on the farm?
Yeah, just to add, if you're going to cite new wind or solar in Indiana today, it's highly likely going to be on ag ground or reclaimed mine ground. Those are the locations it's going to land. And unfortunately, I think a lot of the experience is we'll take solar as the example, is laying on that nice flat prime farm ground. And not so much the marginal stuff, right? That's maybe lower yielding, and just do the nature construction and what's easiest. So that's created some issues. And, because some of those contracts can be for 25 plus years and you're essentially taking that ground out of production. And it's been cited, just aesthetic issues with neighbors and that sort of thing. So some cons. But on the pros, diversified income stream that Dr. Dukes mentioned, reduced greenhouse gas footprint if you're going to really start measuring these things. And when you look at net metering and selling back to the grid during times of less farm demand, when you're not drying grain, maybe it could make sense.
Okay, Bob. Thank you very much, Jordan. Bring us home.
Dr. Dukes mentioned grain dryers, and that as the largest energy user on the farm is a grain dryer. And if you go out and drive around rural Indiana, some of those grain dryers are old, in decades. And the efficiency of those dryers has improved so much that it is unbelievable. And there was, at one point in time, there was a federal grant set up that you could go out and change out your grain drying system. Jordan also mentioned, some of the issues with wind and solar when it comes to siting. There's a lot of things that the individual farmer can do using biodiesel for that, in that regard. 85% ethanol in some of his other vehicles. So there's a lot of different things that they can do. Some of them are doing, but at the end of the day, it's got to pay its own way, and the farmer's got to see that return. As stated earlier, they are different revenue streams. We'll see methane digesters, I think, increase as right now, dairies have the target there. What you're not going to see is them on hog farms, which we've got plenty of, for various reasons. And the technical expertise is coming along. The different feed additives that Jordan mentioned earlier are changing the dynamics of the digesters. So there's a lot of things going on in that realm. But as we've said before, there's a lot more that needs to be done.
Yeah, there's no doubt that the pace of innovation is rapid, and trying to keep up with it has got to be head spinning. at its core, farming is a business, and you try to do the best you can with what you have. And so it'll be interesting to see how these practices become adopted and how we can all work together to help our ag industry recognize the benefits of it, and at the same time promote those benefits that are widely across the state and the country and the globe, as we discussed earlier. So we've reached the point where we need to finish up, and I want to say thank you to Jordan and Bob and Jeff. You benefited. We benefited from your knowledge and your expertise here, and your clear answers. And so, thank you very much for that, and your contributions to the conversation, and as we all work together going forward. This is the conclusion of our discussion today. So I want to thank all of the folks who tuned in. We had a nice crowd today. And thank you for engaging with the Nature Conservancy in Indiana. If you'd like to learn more about our policy agenda and the many ways in which you can help advance it, please visit nature.org/Indiana Climate. That's nature.org/Indiana Climate, and join our mailing list. So thanks again to our congressional delegation, Senator Braun, Senator Young, Representative Hollingsworth. Thank you to Jordan Sager from the State Ag Department, to Jeff Dukes from Purdue's Climate Research Center, and Bob White from the Indiana Farm Bureau. And thank you all for joining us. I hope you all have a great afternoon. Take care.